Hello and welcome to Fire Headlines, where we discuss the hottest topics in fire service news. I'm your host, Samantha Didion, and I'm very excited to announce to our listeners today that we officially have a new co-host for the show. Joining me today is Chief Ken Kehmna. Ken is a veteran of over 35 years in the fire service, bringing extensive experience to the podcast. He has served in key roles including fire chief and led significant integrations of emergency services. With a background in both local and national fire management, he holds a bachelor's degree in management from St. Mary's College and a master's degree in executive fire service leadership from Grand Canyon University. Ken, welcome to the podcast. Is there any interesting facts that you'd like to share with our listeners, and maybe what you're looking forward to adding to the podcast?
Absolutely. First of all, thank you very much, Samantha. Thank you for the kind introduction and good job on the name. I know it's not always easy to say. It catches people a lot, but good job. Yeah, I as you said, I spent 35 years in the fire service. If you count the time that I did before I was actually, in the fire service, getting paid to be in the fire service, I was a volunteer and an explorer. I mean, I've been doing this almost my entire life, since I was a teenager and in high school. This is really it's just been a mission for me ever since I was really young, and something that I'm fully dedicated to. I retired out of the fire service in California and actually moved up to Central Oregon and worked for a few more years for a fire department up here before fully retiring from active duty. I have maintained all my relationships with the Western Fire Chiefs Association. I've continued to work with Western Fire Chiefs Association, which has obviously been a real thrill for me. But I even maintained connections with the National Wildfire Coordinating Group and with FireScope, and I've maintained connections to all those folks that I built relationships with over the course of my career, and it's been a real treat. As I said, I retired out of California. I now live in Central Oregon, so I live in Bend, Oregon, which is okay. So it's a good place for mountain biking, which is something that I like to do. So I'm really happy to be here in Central Oregon now.
And what are some things that you're looking forward to chatting about on the podcast?
Well, it's funny. When we first started talking about doing this, I love podcasts. For me, podcasts fill this really interesting sort of space in the things that I listen to. I will put them on in the background when I'm doing something else that I really like to do, when I'm doing something I want to focus on, like if I'm in my shop. So putting a podcast on for me is always like inviting a couple of friends to just someone to listen to and to talk to, even though you're not actually interacting necessarily with the folks on the podcast. As you get to know them and you listen to them, you kind of have this connection to them. And that's really what I'm looking for. As a fire chief, one of the things that I really came to appreciate, well, actually, I forget being a fire chief, the fire service. One of the things I really enjoyed and continue to enjoy about the fire service is the ability to connect with the colleagues that I already know and those that I don't know. We connect very, very quickly. We have common experiences. We've dealt with common issues. We've worked out common, solutions to those problems. And to me, it's like increasing your friend group. So for me, that's really what I'm looking to do. I'm looking to have a really comfortable, hopefully entertaining conversation about a variety of things. I am not the expert in anything, but some of these things just need to be talked about, so that's what I'm looking for. I'm hoping people find it engaging, informative, and educational.
Yeah, me too. And a fire chief once told me that it's impossible to have too many connections in the fire service. So here's to building more connections.
I would say that is absolutely true. You are quite right, Samantha.
Well, our topic today is quite an interesting one, especially for your debut. The topic is violence towards first responders. 2 articles shared in the Daily Dispatch this past week shared stories of firefighters being attacked while responding to calls. Now, we're not going to go into all of the details of these 2 articles, but I will share that the first incident was a woman in Los Angeles crashing her vehicle into a firefighter's vehicle after first yelling at him. And the second article is a man from North Carolina who fired shots at fire and EMS officials while fleeing the scene of a vehicle fire. Now, links to these two articles can be found in our show notes, but Ken, I want to ask you, have you ever experienced something like this during your career, or is this a new trend? And I say trend lightly. Is this something new in today's world?
Yeah, I'm glad you said that, because I was going to say I don't know if trend, I don't know if we're there. I hope we're not there with regards to trend. Um, the I wouldn't say that I've experienced anything like the two stories that we saw. One was obviously, well, I take that back. We actually have. In fact, it was right as I was beginning my fire service career. We had somebody steal an ambulance and take a joyride in one of our ambulances. They weren't violent, thankfully. We weren't there. We happened to be actually inside dealing with the patient. Came out to find no vehicle to take to the hospital, which was a bit of a unique experience for us because we really didn't think that anybody would do such a thing. And that's going back quite a ways. So things have happened periodically over the course of my career. They've been like, okay, we need to be a little bit, more careful. I think where we did see a little more focused energy towards first responders and specifically the fire service, the riots following the Rodney King trial were a great example of where we actually did see a little bit of an increase in violence towards first responders in general, and I think that's the kind of thing that we do see. Certainly on individual calls, I have experiences that we've put ourselves in harm's way without realizing we were putting ourselves in harm's way, and those sorts of things. But it has happened, yeah.
So going back to the two articles I mentioned, I didn't dive into exactly how these departments responded to the incidences, but can you tell us what types of training that fire and EMS personnel do receive to handle these kinds of scenarios?
Well, first and foremost, one of the things that is really important, and I know the vast majority of our listeners that have experience in the fire service will totally identify with this because it was likely a practice where you are. But if you're not, every time we respond to almost any call, there's a law enforcement presence as part of that. Whether it's to a structure fire, they're going to be responding for the purposes of controlling traffic and providing security around the scene. But if we're responding to a call with even a medical call, any routine medical call, law enforcement is always part of that response. When those calls have a potential for the scenario to be dangerous, specifically if it's potentially violent, whether it's somebody who is injured, because of domestic abuse or something of those sorts of things. Law enforcement is always first on scene. Law enforcement is always the one who determines that the scene is safe for fire personnel to enter so that they can provide the care that is necessary or mitigate the hazard, whatever it happens to be. And there's a lot of reasons for that. Primarily because law enforcement professionals have the statutory responsibility and legal ability to provide that kind of safety and security for us. Firefighters responding to a call, we're not law enforcement. We don't have the same responsibility to enforce the law. We don't have any of those kinds of things. So that the training that we do get is for our own personal protection, ensuring that we're obviously putting our rigs in a safe position, that we're taking care of our own personal safety, and that we're not putting people in harm's way. When law enforcement responds with us on any of these incidents, typically they will respond in first. They will make contact. They'll make sure that the scene is safe, and then by radio, they let us know that it is safe to enter the scene. That's a really critical part. Because we get dispatched at the exact same time, we will show up at the exact same time. And there are instances where we have been on scene as the incident continues to unfold and the scene is absolutely not safe. So it's really critical that we follow the training that we have been given, make sure that we don't roll into the scene too quickly and put ourselves in harm's way. It has happened. And that's it can be very dangerous. So we really need to be careful of those kinds of things.
So, kind of in that same tone, what best practices exist for coordinating with law enforcement during, incidences involving a threat?
So as I mentioned, we obviously communicate by radio, and there's been discussions about communications and our ability to communicate with other disciplines, whether it's law, fire, emergency management, emergency service, emergency medicine. That conversation has been going on for quite some time. To boiling it all the way down to its basic elements, the very first thing you can do is have a relationship with your law enforcement providers. That is number one. Um, we law, fire, and emergency medical services, even if EMS is integrated into the fire service, we have responsibilities for certain things on the emergency scene. And it's important for us to work together as effectively and efficiently as possible. Our law enforcement partners, whether it's our local police department or the local sheriff's office or any number of law enforcement agencies, it really starts with relationships. It starts with knowing one another. So spending time to get to know your other disciplines in your jurisdiction so that you work better and more effectively together is first and foremost. And I mean, and that's sort of that goes throughout the fire department as well, but it's really key because law enforcement resources aren't always co-located with the fire department. Their stations aren't always with ours, and so we don't see them as often. They work more independently. We work more as a team. It's just kind of the difference between the services that we provide. So I think it starts there. The second thing is ensuring that you're well coordinated in your response. That when we roll into an emergency scene, if there is a potential for violence, if there is a potential for danger, that we stage at a safe location. We stage around the corner so that the rig can't be seen. The law enforcement can do what they need to do without us impeding their operations. That's critical. And making sure that we stay, in communications with them. There's a number of ways we can do that. Unfortunately, oftentimes that communications has to pass through a communication center and then back to the fire agency because they're not on the same communication system. But we've addressed a lot of that in the last few years. So there is the possibility to speak more directly with law enforcement. But that's really it. The more you practice and play together, the more we work with one another. It's not a police department. It's an individual. It's somebody It's somebody you spent time with. And it makes things much easier because it just makes things easier. One of the things I think, and it is definitely tied to the potential for us to respond to violent incidents specifically directed at first responders. One of the things that I would really want to highlight about the relationship that we have with other stakeholders, and I mentioned law enforcement quite a bit, but it's law enforcement, emergency management, our dispatch centers and the dispatchers that work in those centers. One of the things that has grown significantly in the last, we'll say 20 years, and it continues to grow, is our ability to support one another. And our ability to support one another. And I say this because, back in the day, many of us would just, after the scene, we put everything away, get everything cleaned up, roll back to the station, and just sort of, you know, churn on what we just dealt with and what we went to. That is no longer the standard. It is no longer the expectation that we just sort of, suck it up and move on. We've gotten much, much better at caring for one another, specifically our exposure to critical incidents, our exposure to trauma, our exposure to things that can be difficult to handle. Many agencies, inclusive of the ones that I have worked at, had critical incident management teams who would offer support to the first responders, all first responders. So my organization, the Santa Clara County Fire Department, that critical incident stress debriefing team would, after a significant event, they would bring together everybody that was on that incident that wanted to come, to a debriefing session, law, fire, emergency management, dispatchers, everybody that was involved in it, into a safe space where they could discuss the incident. They could sort of come down from the stress of it and all of that and talk about it. And a really just a significant improvement in terms of caring for our mental health from the outset. The reason I bring that up now is because as we talk about the other disciplines, that not being insular, not being the fire department taking care of fire department, is like, this is all of us. Bringing in our dispatchers was the moment where I'm like, that's the thing. They're answering on the phone, they're dispatching, they're hearing all of the stress, they're hearing our stress, they're hearing the call go down, and then it all goes away. So when we have these traumatic incidents, they need that closure too, because they weren't there. So we bring them into the room as well. And I think it's really taken us to a new place where we recognize that over time, the cumulative trauma of seeing these things and dealing with these things and worrying about these things has an impact. We all have a different role and responsibility. I said I was going to come back to this. The fire service, I think, I've always been super protective of the public trust, because I think that I fully recognize and identify with the fact that the fire service enjoys a level of trust with our community that is, I won't say second to none, but sometimes I feel like it is second to none, and I will absolutely treat it like it's second to none, because I believe it's that valuable. The level of access that we have, the intimacy that is created in those emergency scenes where we're in the house with somebody and they're dealing with something traumatic and they don't know what to do, and we're the ones. That to me, that's it. That's the thing. That's what the community deserves, and that's what they get from us. And so protecting that is critical. Our law enforcement partners and our dispatchers don't necessarily get that same enjoyment. So it's important that we pull everybody in together when we sort of deconstruct these incidents and we share responsibility for taking care of one another, that we do it as a group, that because we're all in this together. So I think it's absolutely critical. And I'm really, really, really glad to see the fire and emergency services getting to a place where they recognize this.
Can you share with some of our fire service leaders, or even just first responder leaders, how you began to integrate this and maybe some of the steps that you took to get your department comfortable with talking with one another after a hard incident?
One of the things that I identified with very quickly as I started to move through the ranks into a leadership position was my ability to know when to say yes and recognize that that's probably something I should be paying attention to. And at the department that I worked for, I was in a leadership position, but the true leadership for this kind of effort in my organization and in many like it comes from the rank and file. It comes from the line. It came from the people who were actually responding to the emergencies, and they were saying, look, there is a trend and we need to address this. It was somebody who put their hand up and said, I want to build this team and I want the latitude to be able to do this, and this is what I need the organization to do. And at the outset, it was like, okay, what are we doing? What do you need? How much is it? Typical fire chief stuff. How much is it going to cost? What's the liability? All that kind of stuff. Unfortunately, these are the things we have to ask. But the reality of it is, it came about because I didn't say no to what was arguably a brilliant idea from a member of my staff. And the other thing that was really great about it was because they were sort of building this on their own for their fellow members, the people that were stepping up and filling those positions as sort of peer, I don't want to say peer counselors because that's probably the wrong term, but sort of the peers that were kind of managing the program, there was no barriers between them and those that were coming to the debriefings, right? It wasn't a gold badge and a bunch of bugles and all the other, hierarchy of the fire department or any of that kind of stuff. It was peer to peer. safe space. We're here for you. Be here, don't be here, confident, all that kind of stuff. They really handled it in the right way. To be an effective leader, the best thing you can do is use your ears and just listen.
Yeah, it sounds like it. And with so many things that a fire chief or just a fire service leader in general has to balance, sometimes they do need to be reminded of that. Just listen to your crew, sit down and talk with them, hear what they're going through, and maybe you can learn something. Is there anything else you'd like to add on this topic before we wrap up?
Well, it's funny because anybody listening to this who has spent any time in the fire service, fire chief or not, if you spent time on the line, if you spent time as a firefighter, company officer, battalion chief, whatever, you spent time out there in the station, and all of us did this. We were all fire chief for the moment when we had, why don't they just do what we tell them to do? We have all the right answers. I will tell you, some of the most inspirational things that I have seen and heard and that our organization have done have really come from our folks on the line. They have the ability to sort of think about these things and have dialogue about these things. They're unencumbered by the decision making process, because they don't have to be the fire chief and say yes or no to something. So they free think, which is fantastic. And I've really, really enjoyed the energy and passion that comes from our organization at all levels. And when it comes to things like violence against first responders and addressing those kinds of things, our response to that, our solution, doesn't rest with the fire chief and me making some decision or me coming up with some brilliant idea. It really rests with us as an organization saying, how are we going to address this and evolve? Because that's really what we will need to do, is sort of evolve as a service to accommodate for the changes around us. And so yeah, that's the way I think we approach it, and that's the way I would certainly want to approach it as a team, like we do everything else.
Yeah, very well said. Thank you, Chief. And thank you to our listeners for tuning in. If you haven't already, be sure to subscribe and follow us on social media. We'll see you back here next week for more Fire Headlines.